So thank you all for coming. As you all are aware, this is the memorial for Dr. Hal Cooper, who all of us probably have our own relationship to and so forth. The nature of this memorial, I think, will what I would like to do with this memorial is give people a sense of the depth of Hal's vision and thinking and his commitment to the future development of mankind. He was extremely passionate about that, as many of you, of course, in this room have some sense of that. And so that's, I think, what would like to get across. I think just maybe to start things out, maybe to set the tone, we'd like to start out with a musical offering. Tony Jennings will give a presentation. Going Home, correct, Tony?
Yes.
I don't know if you have anything to
Um,
on it, or?
No, I think most people probably know this piece. It's in English, so you'll certainly understand what's being said. It's by Anton Dvorak, and we will. You need actually this. You can use this, and I can hold the music. I can do that. In fact, this might be easier than this thing. Just 1 minute. Do you want me to take this off?
I was pulling the suit out of the closet and recognized that my tie was slightly disheveled, and then I thought, wait a second, this is the memorial for Hal Cooper, who's notorious for being disheveled. He, as far as the aesthetic of his personal sense, what he lacked in that, he was totally passionate about the aesthetics for building a beautiful future for mankind, at least writing the blueprints for that. So we'll definitely be taking that up. Some of which will be in his own words. There will be a presentation, about a 20-minute presentation that he did at the New York University for a infrastructure and economic development conference hosted by the Schiller Institute. So we'll come to that in a moment here, but as I mentioned, we'll start out with the musical offering. Yeah. Ready?
We are ready.
So, as people may or may not know, Dr. Cooper passed away October 25th, I believe it was, just recently, obviously. And I think in February he would have been 80. So certainly would have liked to have had him longer, obviously. And as I mentioned, I think the point of the discussion today, or the presentation today, would be to give a sense of what Hal's commitment was to the future development of humanity, and that this be a living memorial in that sense. I think people have different experiences, different relationship to Hal, and it'd be good to hear those different insights, different perspectives. But at least the first part of it will at least give a sense of what the vision that Hal had, and really how he elaborated that vision by creating some of the blueprints for the potential future development for mankind. And so what I'd actually like to just start out briefly, because much of what Hal did in terms of putting this blueprint together was related to the huge development projects that he was committed to. And it's funny because his work with Mr. LaRouche and Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche, there was often a point to Hal where he would look at some of the things that Mr. LaRouche took up and would say, well, that seems not very practical. I'm a practical guy, which always struck me as funny, because the kinds of projects that Hal helped to elaborate were anything but practical. He literally traveled from the West Coast through British Columbia up through Alaska as part of his mapping out the connection through the Bering Strait that would be connecting the rail routes from North America over to what eventually would become the new Silk Road. And Hal was instrumental in the 1990s, before anybody even heard anything about the new Silk Road, or what is today called the One Belt, One Road, which is the project that China launched in 2013. Hal was putting this idea together along with people in the Schiller Institute that were working with Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche. So he helped shape what eventually became the Belt and Road, and of course wrote the other development plans for where humanity has yet to go. So what I'd like to do is just start out with it's about a 7-minute presentation from 1997, which is from Mr. LaRouche, giving an insight into what this project was that Hal would go on to play a significant role in outlining.
There are only two nations which are respectable left on this planet. That is, nations of respectable power. That is the United States, particularly the United States, not as represented by the Congress, but by the President. It is the identity of the United States which is a political power, not some concatenation of its parts. The United States is represented today only by its President as a political institution. The Congress does not represent the United States. They're not quite sure who they do represent these days, since they haven't visited their voters recently. The President is institutionally the embodiment of the United States in international relations. The State Department can't do that. The Justice Department can't do it. No other department can do it. Only the President of the United States under our Constitution can represent the United States as an entity. Its entire personality, its true interest, its whole people. Now, there's only one other power on this planet which can be so insolent as that toward other powers, and that's the Republic of China. Now, China is engaged presently in a great infrastructure building project in which my wife and others have had an ongoing engagement over some years. There's a great reform in China, which is a troubled reform. They're trying to solve a problem. That doesn't mean there is no problem. but they're trying to solve it. Therefore, if the United States, so the President of the United States and China, participate in fostering that project, sometimes called the Silk Road Project, sometimes the Land Bridge Project. If that project of developing development corridors across Eurasia, into Africa, into North America, is extended, that project is enough work to put this whole planet into an economic revival. And I'll get into just a bit of that to make it more sensuously concrete to you. Now, China has had cooperation with the government of Iran for some time. Iran has actually been completing a number of rail links which are an extension of China's land bridge program, or Silk Road Project. More recently, we've had on the side of India, from Indian leadership, which has met with the representatives of China, to engage in an additional route among the land routes for the land bridge program. One goes into Kunming in China. Where I was in that area was in Mishinau during the part of World War II, and we were out of Mishinau. We had planes flying into Kunming, over the hump, as they used to say in those days. Quite familiar with that area. But if you have water connections, canal connections, and rail connections from Kunming through Mishinau, that area, across Bangladesh, into India, across to Pakistan, into Iran, up to the area just above Tehran, south of the Caspian. You have linked to the Middle East, you have linked to Central Asia, you have linked to Turkey, you have linked to Europe. Then you have a northern route, which is pretty much the route of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was built under American influence and American advice by Russia. You have a middle route, which is being developed in Central Asia with China and Iran. India is working on a plan which involves only a few hundreds of kilometers of rail to be added. There are a lot of other improvements along the right-of-way, which would link the area north of Tehran through Pakistan, through India, through Bangladesh, through Myanmar, into Kunming, into Thailand, into Vietnam, down through Malaysia and Singapore, across the straits by a great bridge, into Indonesia. There's a plan also for the development of a rail link through what was northern Siberia, across the Bering Straits, into Alaska, and down into the United States. There's a Middle East link, of several links, from Europe as well as from China, but from China, Middle East link into Egypt, into all of Africa. So that what we have here is a set of projects which are not just transportation projects like the Transcontinental Railroads of the United States, which was the precedent for this idea back in the late 1860s and 1870s. But you have development corridors where you develop on an area of 50 to 70 kilometers either side of your rail link, your pipeline, so forth. You develop this area with industry, with mining, with all these kinds of things, which is the way you pay for a transportation link. Because of all the rich economic activity, every few kilometers of distance along this link, there's something going on, some economic activity. People working, people building things, people doing things. To transform this planet in great projects of infrastructure building, which will give you the great industries, the new agriculture, and the other things we desperately need. There is no need for anybody on this planet who's able to work to be out of work. That's simple. And that project is the means. If the nations which agree with China, which now includes Russia, Iran, India, other nations, if they engage in a commitment to that project, which they're building every day, if the United States, that is the President of the United States, Clinton, continues to support that effort as he's been doing, at least politically, then what do you have? You have the United States and China and a bunch of other countries ganged up together against the greatest power on this planet, which is the British Empire, called the British Commonwealth. That's the enemy. And if on one bright day, say a Sunday morning after a weekend meeting, the President of the United States, the President of China, and a few other people say, we have determined this weekend, based on our advisors and the facts, that the international financial and monetary system is hopelessly bankrupt. And we, in our responsibility as heads of state, must put these bankrupt institutions into bankruptcy reorganization in the public interest. And it is in our interest to cooperate as nations in doing this, to avoid creating chaos on this planet. The result then is that such an announcement on a bright Sunday morning will certainly spin the talking heads on Washington TV. But otherwise, it means that the entire system is of that moment has been put through the guillotine and the head is rolling down the street. Alan Greenspan's head, perhaps. That means we have at that point the impetus for building immediately a new financial and monetary system. Now, in putting a corporation which is bankrupt into viable form, what do? You've got to find the business that it's going to do, which is the basis for creating the new credit to get that firm going again. The Land Bridge program, with its implications on a global scale, is the great project which spins off directly and indirectly enough business, so to speak, for every part of this world to get this world back on a sound basis again.
So obviously this was 1997 that Mr. LaRouche made this presentation. Some of the issues you may recognize as still being alive today, but what is more alive now since 1997 is the fact that China initiated the New Silk Road in 2013. And that has set up a new economic model where more and more nations are becoming involved with this New Silk Road project. What China calls the One Belt, One Road. This was presented in Nazarbayev University in 2013 by Xi Jinping. There's now 160 nations involved in this. It has set up a new potential for the nations of Africa. It's spilling over into Africa as well as South America in terms of similar initiatives, in terms of large-scale infrastructure, airports, ports, rail development, and so on. And has set up a means by which these nations that want to develop, which previously had to rely on the investments of Wall Street and London, can and now get the development that they have needed. Unfortunately, Wall Street and London are still addicted to the old model, which is speculative finance and no investments into the real economy. And that has set the world at loggerheads with China and the nations that are working with China, especially Russia, and increasingly including Japan, India, and so forth. And so what I'd like to give just a brief sense of is, Hal has been instrumental in developing these ideas. And as I said, pursuing them with his idea of what should be practical. In other words, he viewed that this is just what humanity should be doing. So this was the report that the Schiller Institute put out, or EIR, which is the organizations working with Mr. LaRouche. In 1996, there was a series of conferences in Beijing that was on the idea of the New Silk Road. This was somewhat posed in the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet system, the fall of the communist system, and so on, to have a kind of economic integration between East and West that would actually pull nations out of poverty and begin to link them so that there's a sense of mutual advantage in these large projects. And so many of these routes and so forth, Hal spent, as Helga describes it, we would spend hours. Helga Zepp LaRouche, the president of the Schiller Institute, founder of the Schiller Institute, referred to the long evenings that she would spend with Hal just mapping these projects out. So I don't have the exact article in here, but this is from 2002, and there's an article from Hal in here, actually it's an interview, about a presentation that he had given in Russia, Novosibirsk. It's something like the National Rail Institute University. And the presentation was to about 400 people. He was the only American actually invited to present. And on the panel, he actually, one of the members of the panel that he spoke with was a woman from Korea, from South Korea, who was actually speaking on the importance of what was being called at the time in Korea as the Iron Silk Road, and the importance that that would play in the economic reunification of North and South Korea. And that is also presently any ability for peace on the Korean Peninsula, on the question of denuclearization and so on, will come with the economic development, which means North Korea's integration into this new Silk Road project. Obviously, the intersection of the Koreas, Japan, Russia, China, that's a very critical part of the world. But these were the kind of discussions that Hal was involved in on the question of Korean integration via rail, and that conference just as an example of it. But he went on to speak at numerous conferences across the world. This is a 2007 conference in Germany, and actually we have among us here Mr. Craig Thorpe, who is the artist who did these paintings that people are probably familiar with. I assume paintings, or
yeah,
okay.
In watercolor.
Okay, great, yeah. So, and actually, Greg may have a few things to add. He may have to head out a little early. So, so anyway, so this was a presentation that Hal gave in Germany in 2007. There was, again, we could spend an entire class or an entire few hours here going through all of the people that were at this conference and the kind of discussions that Dr. Cooper had. But one of the key people was a series of academicians from Russia who were part of the discussion of the Bering Strait connection. And that, of course, is what this painting here presents, which Hal was always very animated that he's like, you got to give people something they can look at, so they can see what it is that you're actually trying to get to them. So he had Craig on a number of projects illuminating these ideas, which were in his mind. And of course, Hal he probably was on that island out there at some point. He seemed to have gone just about everywhere across the Arctic region of the planet. So this is another conference that Hal presented in Ottawa on obviously Canada's role in especially the Bering Strait connection. So again, as I mentioned, this ultimately led to the decision by the Chinese government as part of really a longer arc. As you heard Mr. LaRouche say, in 1997, China was already beginning with the idea of the new Silk Road, even back then, laying the groundwork for that. So the 2013 announcement at Nazarbayev University, where it was formally announced that China was actively pursuing the new Silk Road as a policy, had been a long discussion and things being set into motion, of which, again, we could go on in terms of the number of conferences and so forth that Hal was at. 2008, he was at a major conference in Istanbul. It was actually an international rail conference where he gave a presentation on the idea of the Eurasian land bridge. So he was instrumental in seeding the big idea that was to become the practical idea that he considered it. So this is then after the 2013 announcement. Hal also played a crucial role in elaborating the next phase of development, that for Africa, that for South America, projects like the Darien Gap, of which we will get through Hal's presentation at the New York University that we'll get to in a moment. You'll get a sense of all the different things that he was actually involved in. That speech by Hal is about 20 minutes. I don't know if you would like to say something now, or if you want to wait.
We can stay.
You sure? Okay, okay. So maybe we'll just jump to that. As I mentioned, we probably could go on for some time in terms of the things that he was involved in, but it'd obviously be good to hear from people in the room that, you know, also were involved in different projects. I know Thomas Fuller is going to present some of the work that he did in Africa, around different projects in Africa. So, so again, this was April 7th, 2017. This was a New York University School of Engineering event where they, in light of the announcement of the New Silk Road and how the United States could integrate into that, because obviously what China initiated was not a new phenomena. This was what we did with the Transcontinental Railroad. This is what we've pursued under the better presidents of the United States, or better government and people within Congress and so forth. Always pursued the idea of large-scale infrastructure as a means to provide a foundation for economic activity. So this was an event at the New York University where those ideas were being taken up. So I think I'll just present Dr. Cooper in his own words. This is again about 19 minutes here, and then we'll open it up for people's thoughts on the matter.
Jason, thank you very much. It's good to be here in New York. And I'm going to be talking about the One Belt, One Road. I'm going to emphasize the Bering Strait Tunnel, but I'm also going to overlap some with the previous speaker who spoke about Latin America. The Alene and LaRouche political movement, the Schiller Institute, has been really instrumental in first promoting the Eurasian land bridge concept, and finally the world rail network, the interconnection of infrastructure through all the continents of the world and to all the countries of the world. And it's very important that their role has been one of publicizing this going back many years, and I've been involved with the organization since 1991, and some of these early maps, and especially that early report, I helped them put together. The Eurasian land bridge is really the concept by which the entire program can come together. You've, of course, seen this in some of the previous presentations today, and especially going from Skоворodino on the Trans-Siberian Railway through Yakutsk and Chukotka to the Bering Strait at a place called Ulan at the eastern end of the region of Chukotka, across from the Bering Strait in Wales, Alaska. And I have been in both places previously. Thank you. Now, there's an extensive network already in place in both Europe and Asia for rail. And the Trans-Siberian Railway, which was completed in the early 1890s over the strong opposition of the British financial interests, interestingly enough, because they didn't want it to interfere with their maritime domination. And William Engdahl, who's been associated with the Alene and LaRouche political movement, has written a number of books, including some recently. Anglo-American Oil Politics and the New World Order. He said this is why World War I was started, to prevent French, American, and Russian interests from building the Bering Strait Tunnel, as a matter of background. The next view, please. The Chinese, the Russians, and increasingly throughout Asia and Europe, there is now a network of railroads across the Eurasian landmass, both conventional speed and high speed, both diesel and electric, and a very limited amount of steam and places in China and India, but almost entirely diesel and electric now. There are a series of rail, northern, central, and southern corridors that are in the process or have already been developed. Cargoes have moved to Istanbul from China. They've moved from Germany and England to China, to and from. And also the Russians and the Chinese are working on actually building a high-speed rail line along the present Trans-Siberian Railway between Moscow and Beijing, crossing the border into China at Manzhouli in the Inner Mongolian Autonomous Region. And also, there is a proposal to going across Mongolia. There is extensive effort now to develop a high-speed rail line between Moscow and Kazan, southeast of Moscow, into Kazakhstan, which would then go ultimately to Beijing, basically following the existing Eurasian Land Bridge corridor. And there is a modification of that route, which actually would come through Central Asia, through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan into Iran, and then to Turkey. And there have been cargoes already going along that route. Next row, please. This diagram showed up in the original 1997 report on the Eurasian Land Bridge becoming the World Land Bridge, and looks like I had something to do with that. I'm extremely pleased to see the presentation this afternoon about what's happening in Latin America. That's very important because there was a need to connect North America and South America, and believe it or not, from the time of President Lincoln through President McKinley, there was an effort by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to actually begin the work, and they developed the plans to building the railroad even before the Panama Canal was built. But it got stopped, and that was very unfortunate, and this is when the revolution took place in Colombia, where Panama was broken off. And also, as was just discussed earlier, there's really a network that's now being proposed in South America to connect the countries. And interestingly enough, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Peru have all either said they're going to join the Eurasian Land Bridge and the One Belt, One Road program, or they are already on board. But to do that, there has to be a connection between South America and North America, which will cross into Asia at the Bering Strait. Next view, please. The Linda LaRouche Political Movement, the Schiller Institute, Executive Intelligence Review. The New Silk Road becomes the World Land Bridge. This was the model, this was the ideological background for how and why this system and this network should be built to connect railroads throughout the world. Next slide, please. Believe it or not, Russia proposed a highway from London to New York through the Bering Strait, basically following the Trans-Siberian Railway where it was built, other railroads, and then going from Nome and Fairbanks, Alaska, through Chicago to New York. And that was set as a railroad or a highway, but it also included a railroad. And that even proposed a bridge across the Bering Strait. I'll discuss that later, and maybe that's not the best mode to go through the Bering Strait because of the weather. Next slide. In the early spring of 2013, early 2015, I received a call from a reporter at the Atlantic Monthly Magazine that said they wanted to do an article about this superhighway, super railroad through the Bering Strait between Russia and the United States. I was interviewed, a mining engineer in Alaska by the name of Fyodor Soloviev and Mr. Vladimir Yakunin, who was then the president of the Russian Railway, were all interviewed, and we were all quoted as saying this was a concept that needed to be turned into an implementation where it would actually happen. It was published in July of 2015. The only public acknowledgement that I personally ever received was about 2 weeks later. I got a call from KIRO Radio in Seattle, who interviewed me, and then absolutely nothing happened. And it was very obvious that there were people who didn't want this out in the open. Next view, please. Now, several years ago, when I actually did a feasibility study of building a railroad between Alaska and the lower 48, and my project sponsor said, well, look, I want you to look at the Bering Strait Tunnel. I want you to look at traffic going to Russia, China, and India. And it was not on the emphasis of the railroad physical facilities as much as it was, what was it going to haul? Because if you couldn't answer that question, you were never going to build the railroad. And one of the paintings that came out of this was a conception of what the eastern end of the proposed Bering Strait Tunnel would look like. And I commissioned the rail artist Craig Thorpe to do this painting. And at the time I was doing this feasibility study for the Canadian Arctic Railway Company based in Vancouver in British Columbia, and their proposed passenger train color scheme would be on the left, and in the center was a Russian locomotive from the Russian railway carrying empty tank cars of oil. And the third was a container train carrying containers from the United States to China. And if and when this tunnel was ever built, the vast majority of this traffic would go between the United States and China through Russia. Next view, please. The Bering Strait Tunnel would be probably 65 to 70 miles long. Where it's built, the water is between 160 and 180 feet deep. There's limestone and granite rock below. It's okay for building tunnels. There's not much seismic activity in that particular area. There may be some artificially created environmental obstacles put in the way, but it's certainly something that can be done. You have native organizations on both sides of the Bering Strait in Chukotka, and you also have the native corporations in Alaska. And their attitude is, well, as long as we benefit, this is a good idea. Now, there's another infrastructure issue we have to deal with, and that's down not too far from Vancouver. It's called the Fraser River Canyon. It goes between Kamloops and Hope, British Columbia. And if any of you have ever driven across Highway 1, across the western part of Canada, you'll drive right up through the middle of the Fraser River Canyon. And it's very steep on both sides, and it's got two tracks, one on one side of the river and one on the other side of the river, the Fraser River. And if you're going to build another railroad, you're not going to put it on the existing tracks because, first of all, they're carrying 120 to 140 trains a day, and secondly, it's designed for slow freight trains, not fast passenger trains. So we'd have a fairly major project, probably between a 65 and an 85 mile long viaduct, of which the Chinese have become experts at building. But we also have to build the West Coast Corridor, and that goes between Vancouver and San Diego and Tijuana, through Seattle, Portland, San Francisco Bay Area, and Los Angeles to San Diego. Now, we have an interior route through the Central Valley, through Oregon, Washington. It basically gets along the existing corridor. But you do have a need to go through the San Joaquin Valley, but that isn't where people are, and we would need a new line along Highway 101 through the northwestern part of California, from Grants Pass, Oregon, down to San Francisco through Del Norte, Humboldt, Mendocino, Sonoma, and Marin counties, including a tunnel under San Francisco Bay into San Francisco from Sausalito or from San Rafael. Now, California already has a high-speed rail system that actually some of the initial parts are under construction. There has been a great deal of opposition expressed by the Republican delegation in California. In fact, they asked the Secretary of Transportation not to fund the electrification of the commuter rail line between San Francisco and San Jose so they could stop the high-speed rail from being built. Now, this is at the same time President Trump is proposing that we spend money on infrastructure. Sounds like our dots aren't getting connected too well. My own personal feeling is you probably need more than one north-south route between the Bay Area and Sacramento, south to Southern California. Next slide. What do you need to build? Well, we have another tunnel besides the Bering Strait Tunnel, and that's the one under the Grapevine. Grapevine is a grade that goes from south of Bakersfield at a place called Grapevine, right at the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley, right up to the top of Tejon Pass at 4,000 feet from 1,000 feet. And that would be a 32-mile long tunnel. It would be based on the Gotthard Base Tunnel that's just been finished in Switzerland under St. Gotthard Pass. And it would have 3 to 4 tracks, and it would be able to handle intermodal trains, because you have anywhere from 20 to 25,000 trucks a day going over Interstate 5 between Los Angeles and Bakersfield. And you would also, perhaps, I have a new painting that was done afterwards, which has the official California high-speed rail colors, and it also shows an oil train. Believe it or not, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad back in 2001 expressed an interest in building this exact same project, but they decided not to do it at the time. Next view, please. Now, at the other end of California, and I think those of you that are familiar with Interstate 5 driving up in Northern California see Mount Shasta. And next to that is the volcanic peak, and Black Butte is called. And the proposal would be to build a railroad line, have a high-speed maglev line along with Interstate 5. I'm going to have Craig doing a modification of this painting at some time where we actually have a new color scheme with one of the high-speed trains is California High-Speed Rail, and the other one is the Washington, Oregon Cascades, plus the 2 freight tracks for Union Pacific and BNSF. But whether that's going to happen or not remains to be seen. Next view, please. Now, shifting south, this is the Darien Gap, which is a swamp region at the far southern end of Panama, and the Pan American Highway has about a 100-mile gap in far northwestern Colombia and far southeastern Panama through the Tumurando Swamp. And my own feeling is you should run a line along the east side where it shows white. It's outside of that national park zone, which was created basically through the British George Soros efforts to make sure we didn't have any connections between North and South America, and have that go over to a place called Turbo over on the east side of the Gulf of Uraba, which is that water place between Colombia and Panama. And then it would go south, and then you go up into mountains, and then you would go down through Ecuador and Peru and connect with the previous proposal that's been presented this afternoon. Next slide. This is one of the ideas for the northern route for, as the previous speaker spoke, on the rail between Santos in Brazil or Rio de Janeiro and Ilo, Peru. And of course, there's another proposal across Bolivia. And then south of there's a proposal for a rail tunnel under the Andes Mountains between Mendoza in Argentina and Valparaiso in Chile. Also, I want you to know that that is exactly the area where the Naquin oil field is. And that's a shale oil field, very similar to the Bakken Formation in North Dakota, with very similar amounts of oil that could be very well developed, and maybe that would be another reason to build the tunnel to haul oil. So, with the map, that shows you what a proposed rail network in South America would be that could grow. And next view, if there's another one. And I also did an extensive feasibility study of building a rail network in Central and Southern Africa. And its purpose would be to connect the Congo with South Africa, both to bring electricity from the proposal for a large 45,000 megawatt dam on the lower Congo River between Kinshasa and the Atlantic Ocean. And the Congo River is the second largest river in the world, next to the Amazon, with very large water resource, and a lot of that power would be pumped south to South Africa, but at the same time they have quite a number of coal-fired power plants, and interestingly enough, the British financial interests have seen that those plants are starved, so we can't get them really in operation, we can't put the emission controls on, et cetera. But we need to have an extensive 15,000-mile transmission line for electricity. And we also need to pump water north from the Congo River Basin into Lake Chad to the north, and then to the east into the upper White Nile River, so we would have plenty of water for Sudan and South Sudan, and this disastrous political stunt of creating a country in South Sudan that's just created nothing but a war needs to be corrected. And then, of course, water would also go to the east and south into Mozambique and Tanzania and Zambia and so forth, as well as Botswana. And then we would have a water, electricity, and rail infrastructure program. Is that the last one? It is. Well, I thank you very much, and I hope this gives you at least a summary overview of some of the infrastructure programs that could be developed with worldwide significance centered on the Bering Strait Tunnel and the Darien Gap. Thank you.